Just to give you an example of how metabolically active the brain is, the brain consumes 20% of all the oxygen in the blood, 25% of all the glucose in the blood, and yet it's only 2% of the weight of the body. Now, one of the first hints that there might be a connection between what you eat and your behavior was by Dr. George Gould back in 1910. So we see this is not completely new. And then we see in 1935 it was found that hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, could mimic many of the serious neurological and psychological conditions like anxiety, neurosis, hysteria, neurasthenia, and even psychosis could be imitated by people becoming hypoglycemic. And then in 1973, Dr. Wendell and Beebe found that there was a 74% incidence of hypoglycemia in people who had schizophrenia, the type of schizophrenia associated with anxiety. In other words, a very hyperactive schizophrenic. Almost three-quarters of them were hypoglycemic. And we'll see what that does. And we're seeing a strong connection between sugar metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism in the brain, and various psychological conditions. For instance, they found 60% of the members of families that have hyperactive children either have diabetes, obesity, alcoholism, all three, which are all sugar consumption problems. So there's a very strong correlation there in hyperactivity in children. More research indicated that 75% of all prisoners were hyperactive as children. So it's taking it back all the way to this childhood that was programming that child for criminal behavior later in their life. Now let's look at the effect of crime and nutrition. This was done by Dr. Stitt, who was a probation officer in Ohio, who did some research on the effect of diet and probation violators. And what she found is that those who remained on a bad diet, a lot of sugar, a lot of junk food, a lot of food additives like MSG, NutraSweet, these things, when they stayed on that, 56% of them ended up violating their probation by committing some antisocial act, robbery, violence, etc. But if they were switched to a healthy diet, only 8% ever broke their probation. So there was a tremendous change in their behavior just by changing their diet. And these are felons. When they looked at narcotic abuse, they found the same thing, is that those who maintained the bad diet, the high sugar diet, junk food diet, 47% of them continued to use narcotics while they were on probation. Whereas those who were switched to the better diet, only 13% of them violated their probation by using narcotics. So it's a rather profound effect. It's not a minor effect. They also coincidentally found there was a dramatic reduction in suicides. So there was a strong correlation between this high sugar, high junk food diet and suicidal behavior. Now the Alabama prison system also did the similar study. They changed the diet of some of the prisoners and used the others as control. They found that there was a 42% reduction in criminal events when they changed these criminals' diet. And that there was a 61% reduction in antisocial behavior at 1 year. Now, all right, let's look at one of the major offenders, and that's sugar consumption. In 1900, Americans consumed about 4 pounds of sugar a year. That's not very much sugar. Now they consume about 129 pounds a year, a 2,500% increase in sugar consumption. So we've seen multiple large studies, well-controlled studies, that the amount of sugar in your diet has direct activity in terms of your criminal behavior, your propensity to violent acts, and to antisocial behavior. And we know that MSG can induce intense rage if you just put minute concentrations in this part of the brain. If you do a little micro injection, you can make a mouse attack a cat. And it can even kill the cat. I mean, it is an intense rage that's almost uncontrollable. Now, when you're hypoglycemic and you add MSG at the same time, you produce a tremendous magnification of this effect. Now, this happens in society all the time. If you go and you have your soda and you're drinking it, and you're nibbling on some Doritos, which are very high in MSG, that's why they taste so good, and your MSG level, your glutamate level in your blood starts to rise. The glutamate stimulates insulin release, the sugar stimulates insulin release, your blood sugar falls, and in susceptible people, which is a lot of people, you can fall into severe rage. Study a prison system in 5 different states, and they looked at adult felons, and they looked for deficiencies in a lot of different nutrients, but mainly magnesium, zinc, folate, and vitamin B6. What they found in all 5 states was that violent offenders had the most deficiencies of all the prisoners. The more violent, the more deficiencies. So it's not just hypoglycemia. Oklahoma Children's Center did a similar study, and they found there was a 43% reduction in serious crime when they changed the diet. They got rid of the high-fat, high-sugar diet and junk food that these childhood offenders were on. When they wanted to objectify it and say, well, is there any objective evidence of change in brain function, they look at EEG function in felons. These are serious criminals, and what they found is that there were about 14 different abnormalities in their EEG. When they switched their diet, it went from 14 to 2 abnormalities. So the EEG improved considerably, and one child went from 6 to 0 abnormalities with giving a simple vitamin. And they found that even marginal deficiencies in nutrition could cause criminal behavior to surface.
As a result of a 27-year-long series of studies, in particular in laboratory animal studies on the relationship of dietary protein with primary liver cancer, another interest of mine at the time. Now, I'm just going to show you just quickly, just a little bit of background what that study said in the very beginning, and certainly it influenced me. Namely, if we take animals, we genetically modify them so that they get cancer, if you will, then feed them 2 different levels of protein. 20%, which is the generous, that's the usually recommended levels, compared to 5%. You can see the 20% protein animals, they grew those cancers well. These are animals genetically modified to get liver cancer. Feed them 20% protein, that's what you get. Feed 5%, you can see there's no effect. This particular experiment here, done in many different ways over the years, showed us that what we could find out that 20% level of protein was generous in terms of its ability to turn on cancer. So in this experiment, for example, switching back and forth, 20% on, 5% off, 20% on, so forth. So protein essentially is controlling cancer. Fed in excess, it generates and grows cancer. In contrast, well, let me say this first. The protein that we used at that time was the prominent protein of cow's milk. I'm coming from a dairy farm. I found that difficult to digest, no pun intended. But in any case, I found that a difficult proposition. But nonetheless, there it was. We did it in so many ways. Elevate protein up to 20%, we get cancer. But soy and wheat protein, 2 plant proteins, turned it off. It's very clear. We did it so many times. It's quite frankly, it's really clear. In fact, this was so prominent that it turns out that casein, the prominent protein of cow's milk, actually is the most relevant cancer-causing chemical ever identified. And I suspect that many of you have not heard that before, but this is the result of dozens of experiments over a long period of time, published, quite frankly, in the very best journals.